Hello, everybody. So this is out of the Los Angeles Times. And when I first was familiarized with this story or put onto this story, it was by looking at a video that Roland Martin, the talk show celebrity and host, had put out. He puts out a lot of information. And then I saw it on the news, and so I was meaning to actually read about what this person, Ed Buck, who is he? What did he do to these men? And so when I read the story, I was really floored by the whole event. And I was thinking to myself, wow, there were people who died in the process, and they just sort of dragged their feet about this whole thing to try to sweep it under the rug. And it so happens that the men that this Democratic donor, Ed Buck is his name, these men that he was involved with, from what I was reading, most of them were black, and they were gay, and he's gay himself. And so I kind of feel like at the end of the article, what they stated, that the reason why they dragged their feet is because they really didn't feel like the lives of the men who succumbed to this madman, their lives didn't really matter. And I think one being it shows that they're black, the other because they're gay. And the other thing that took me back is that where are all the LGBT people promoting protest for the 10 men that succumbed to this Ed Buck? And I was thinking, I said, wow, before I begin this article, I had to put this out there, that I feel like, the more and more you learn about this, the more and more you see that even with the LGBTQ community, that when it comes to black LGBT people, that it seems as though the people whose lives are really significant and stand out are those that are wealthy LGBTQ people, if they're celebrities, if they're famous, if they're popularized in the media. And so I've said this in previous videos, and I feel like people, if they're poor and they're not celebrities, they're not well known, if they're black, if they're female, if, they don't even have to be female. As I'm reading this earlier today, if you're a black LGBTQ person, if you're not famous and popular, you don't have any money, it's as if your life doesn't really count. And so whatever happens, you're on your own unless you have a support system. So this article was out of the Los Angeles Times. There's more than one article. There's been a slew of articles, and there's been news media around this. And the only reason why they say that they brought this out is because some people band together to make some noise about this guy. And they should have done this long ago from what I was reading, and they were dragging their feet on the whole issue. So Democratic donor Ed Buck, he paid at least 10 men to use drugs for his own pleasure, prosecutors say. Now, before I read this, if this is the same article that I read earlier, open your ears, and when you hear the story, if you haven't heard about what this guy did to these men, October is not even here yet? Isn't that the month where creepy stuff usually Well, this was really, they could make a horror movie about this guy right here, what he did to these men. It's awful. So, Democratic donor Ed Buck paid at least 10 men to use drugs for his own pleasure, prosecutors say. So, this is out of the Los Angeles Times. Now, here he looks a lot older, but two, I have reason to believe that it's not just age, it's what he was involved in, because I believe he might have been doing drugs. But he definitely supplied a lot of methamphetamine. So, prominent Democratic Party donor Ed Buck appears in court Thursday on charges of running a drug den in his West Hollywood apartment. So, by James Quealy, Richard Wenton. Okay, so this is put out September 19, 2019. So in political circles, Ed Buck was the best known as a wealthy donor who championed animal rights and LGBTQ causes, dumping more than $500,000 into the coffers of Democratic candidates, running for school boards, Senate seats, and spots on the West Hollywood City Council. Now, this man was really wealthy, and I will honestly say that what they call it, they had abbreviated West Hollywood as WeHo, and you'll find there's a lot of nice restaurants, a lot of upscale places to eat and dine out and go for shows and what have you, and it's expensive living as well. So in West Hollywood Plummer Park, less than a mile from Buck's home, homeless men in desperate circumstances had a much simpler frame of reference for the 65-year-old. They called him Dr. Kevorkian. So I believe this is the article I read earlier, and it is very, very scary. So I must warn you. So a 22-page federal criminal complaint unsealed Thursday painted a depraved picture of how Buck earned his grim sobriquet. Okay, 10 men told investigators that Buck had paid them to use drugs and dress up in skimpy underwear for his own sexual pleasure. So several of the men claimed they lost consciousness after Buck served them a drink and said that they woke up to the sight of him injecting drugs in their arms against their will, according to the complaint. And so, Los Angeles, California, September 19, 2019, U.S. Attorney Nicole Hannon, Wright DA Jackie Lacey, okay, and Sheriff Alex Villanueva, local federal prosecutor sparred over the back case, sources said, or the Buck case. I'm thinking the back cases because in my head I read this and there were people that were not really happy with Lacey, Jackie Lacey, because they feel like a lot of the DA had dragged their feet, and the reason why they gave Ed Buck preferential treatment was because he's a political candidate. He poured a lot of money into the Democratic campaign, animal rights and LGBTQ causes, and also he's very wealthy and white. And so a lot of people felt like he was getting preferential treatment, basically privileged treatment because of that, and being well known in political seats. So Buck was charged Thursday with one count of distributing methamphetamine leading to the death, according to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Los Angeles, and the announcement ended a 2-year saga that had circled around Buck. Local law enforcement leaders and activists from the city's African American and LGBTQ communities, many of whom allege Buck had been ducking the justice system since 2017, an overdose death of Jamel Moore. Okay, so this was a guy who was overdosed and he died at the hands of Ed Buck, allegedly. So Los Angeles County prosecutors charged Buck earlier this week with operating a drug house, but the federal charge could prove far more perilous if convicted of providing the drugs that led to Moore's death, Buck faces a minimum of 20 years in prison. So Buck made a brief appearance in federal court on Thursday afternoon and was ordered held without bond. Calls to his attorney seeking comment were not returned, so investigators have identified 10 additional victims, 9 of whom Buck administered drugs or strongly encouraged them to ingest narcotics as part of an agreement to be compensated for sexual services. U.S. Attorney Nick Hanna told reporters on Thursday. So Buck was arrested at his West Hollywood home Tuesday night, less than a week after a man fled his home, fearing he was suffering a methamphetamine overdose. Prosecutors allege Buck tried to prevent him from getting medical attention, authorities said, so the man was able to get to a gas station and call 911 after September 11th incident, which investigators have said was key to bringing charges against Ed Buck. So the surviving victim statements gave us the break we needed, said the Los Angeles County District Attorney Jackie Lacey, whose office has been the subject of withering criticism for choosing not to prosecute Buck in the past. So Buck's behavior first came under scrutiny July 2017 after Moore, who had been homeless and sometimes worked as an escort, died of methamphetamine overdose. So investigators initially ruled his death to be accidental, but activists and Moore's family quickly challenged that determination. So in the journal found among Moore's possessions, a 26-year-old Texas man blamed Buck for his drug addiction. I've become addicted to drugs, and the worst one at that, the journal said. So Ed Buck is the one to thank. He gave me my first injection of crystal meth. Los Angeles County Sheriff Department revisited the case, and in 2018, investigators asked prosecutors to consider 4 charges in Moore's death: murder, voluntary manslaughter, and furnishing and possessing drugs. So Lacey declined to file a case, citing insufficient evidence. So when a second man, Timothy Dean, who was 55, died of an overdose in Buck's apartment in January, the sheriff department said it would take another look at the first case when the second man died. Buck first gained political notoriety as a self-described conservative Republican while leading a gubernatorial recall effort in Arizona in the 1980s. But he became prominent in California as an in-your-face Democratic activist and booster of animal rights and LGBTQ causes. So in the last decade, he has donated money to all but one member of the current West Hollywood City Council, as well as candidates for Los Angeles School Board and California Senate. So in the same time frame, prosecutors say Buck was luring young disadvantaged men to his home with the promise of drugs and money. So one man who was homeless and sleeping in West Hollywood's Plummer Park in 2011 told investigators that he had never used methamphetamine before he heard of Buck, who was well known for compensating male prostitutes with drugs and money, according to the complaint. So the victim agreed to take a small amount of drugs at Buck's behest, but said Buck then emptied the entire syringe into his arm. So several other men said that Buck wanted to watch them use drugs while they wore tight underwear, according to the complaint, adding that he had become insistent and sometimes forceful if they refused to ingest more narcotics at his command. So 2 men alleged that Buck had injected them with drugs while they slept on his couch, and others suggested he was surreptitiously giving them unknown substances that made them sleepy or weak. So one man told the investigators that Buck hired him as an escort in late 2018. After drinking a clear soda provided by Ed Buck, the man said he felt sleepy and began to lose control of his physical movements, according to the complaint. And when he awoke, Ed Buck was approaching him with 2 additional syringes loaded with methamphetamine, the complaint said. So in March of 2019, just 2 months after Dean was found dead in Buck's home, another man said that Buck also offered him cash and marijuana in exchange for sex. So after taking a drink that Buck described as to be vodka, the man said that he had lost consciousness, and when he awoke, Buck was injecting him with a syringe and had placed metal clamps on his body, according to the complaint. One man who told investigators Buck had contacted him on the website Adam for Adam is what it was called, which is a gay website, said he injected him with what Buck told him was methamphetamine during December of 2018 encounter at Buck's West Hollywood apartment. So the drug rendered him immobile, and the man told investigators that he laid on the floor in Buck's apartment for 6 to 7 hours. Buck grew frustrated at one point, wanted him to leave, and the man said that he couldn't even move. And so then Buck brought out a saw, he said. Buck obtained a power saw from the closet and turned it on and approached the man, the complaint said. So the surge of adrenaline snapped him out of the paralysis, and he told investigator four months later. So Buck refused to pay him, but eventually sent him money through Zelle, a banking application, according to the complaint. So the man involved in most recent case said that he had lived with Buck since late July and claimed they had used drugs and had sex nearly every day for more than a month, according to the complaint. So the decision not to bring charges against Buck last year served as a flashpoint in the city's Black and LGBTQ communities, with many contending he had been spared prosecution because of his ties to Democratic politicians. So others have argued that the case would have been handled differently if the men who had died at the hands of Ed Buck's residents happened to be or were white. So Lacey and the other law enforcement leaders pushed back against the narrative during a news conference Thursday. Lacey said that there was a misconception among the public that multiple victims had come forward to make allegations against Buck. But we have done everything possible to put the depraved sexual predator away, she said. According to the court documents made public Thursday, 5 of the victims who spoke to the investigators came forward in March and April of this year, but 2 other men, both of whom made allegations that Buck injected drugs into their bodies while they were asleep, were interviewed in August and September of 2017, after Moore died, but before Lacey's office declined to press charges. So federal and local prosecutors debated which agency should bring charges against Buck this week, according to the 2 law enforcement sources with knowledge of the case who spoke to the Times, the LA Times, on condition of anonymity. Okay, so one source described the situation as a fight. So Lacey said the federal prosecutors first became involved in the investigation in June, adding that it made no difference to her who ultimately oversaw the case against Buck. So Jasmine Koenig, an activist who served as a spokeswoman for Moore's family and had become a public face to push to have Buck prosecuted, said that the public pressure was the main reason Buck is now and was sitting in jail in the jail cell on Thursday. And so I am happy to give them credit, but not at the exclusion of the community. So Koenig said of the district's attorney's office and sheriff department. So there is a lot of saving face going on by the DA. So this is from Times writer Eileen, and I can't say the last name, contributed to this report. And so Chimendane, I don't know how to say the last name, so it's a long name. So I see several names. So James Quayle and a Richard Winton, okay? And you can look them up. But I found this article to be really, really intriguing because of the fact that I saw it on the news, and then I heard Roland Martin talking about it, and I actually heard the activists who they mentioned, Jasmine Koenig, pretty much talking about how they put Black LGBTQ people, when they are murdered or they're killed, at the back burner. And that is not unlike what I have seen in many of these cases. It's really scary. And so they coined this man, Ed Book, as Dr. Kevorkian, and he was forcing men to do whatever he wanted in his home, sexual favors, and he would inject them, and at times forcibly inject them with methamphetamine and other various drugs, allegedly, is what's been said with the many complaints. And so 10 men were involved, and 9 of whom, I guess, those who are not dead, are still able to file complaint, had pretty much filed complaints about what this man has done to them. And they as in the DA, Lacey, had been dragging their feet on these cases. And it's sad because it takes all of the people looking at this and seeing this for what it is, and actually making some waves to say, look, this is wrong. When they first knew that this guy was a possible suspect in the death of the first men that died, Jamil Moore, why didn't you act then? Now other men are victims because of this. And so he was on a spree, a killing spree is what it looked like. And so, so they labeled him Dr. Kevorkian. So it's really scary, this story, that, that they feel that certain people's lives are not as significant than others. You have to be either famous, or you have to have a lot of money, or you have to have a lot of popularity in order for them to take matters serious, or you have to be somebody that's wealthy and white, and somebody that's well known. And then by you being a politician, you get this extra preferential treatment, even if you're doing things that are against the law, that, it's like, well, of course, I would like to add other things in there, but I guess I know it's not all politicians do the right things, as we see. And so there have been a whole host of other stories that have come out, aside from this, where people who want to either run for political seats have done things that have shown that they're not really fit. Either it's emotional, or either it's just the person themselves. They have a violent streak, or they're a murderer, a serial killer, or they're, a closeted racist. Something is definitely wrong with this picture here. And so I'm glad that some people had made some, complaints, and then had brought this to the forefront, that they had protests. There's a group of people that are being active or proactive about this situation. But, how many more men would he have been able to kill if nobody came forward and said anything about it? That's the question. Well, with that being said, I'm going to let this video go. There's more developing on this story. This story is not over yet. And so I'm going to switch gears here. It's the same story, but the New York Times has slammed disgusting as disgusting for downplaying Ed Buck, okay? All right, and so this right here is just in. And so it says, New York Times slammed as disgusting for downplaying Ed Buck as a small-time Democratic donor. And so people are not really happy about this. And so what will happen to Ed Buck? The New York Times caught flack on Friday for referring to Ed Buck as a small-time Democratic donor. Okay, despite his long history of giving big bucks to liberal politicians, Buck, who was hit
This is about doors.
he was hit.
That kind of sniffing.
Chevron sniffs over 320,000 refinery components for emission levels.
Making sure the levels read
Closing
less than a
that.
marker.
Sorry about that. So it says he was
One of the
hit
ways Chevron is helping
with
keep
a
El
federal
Segundo
charge
clean.
on Thursday of 2017, drug overdosing deaths of 26-year-old Jamil Moore, who has donated tens of thousands of dollars to California candidates. According to the federal records, Buck also contributed more than $500,000 to Democratic groups, including $1,500 to the Obama presidential campaign, $2,950 to Hillary Clinton's campaign, but this fell in the category of small time according to the Times. And so this is not sitting well with a lot of people, and so people are raving about the fact that they're downplaying this guy's credibility. He wasn't small time, that he had a lot of money. And like I told you, I know where the West Hollywood area is, the Hollywood area, because I know full well of the Los Angeles region, and West Hollywood is very upscale in terms of the LGBTQ community. And so, you probably have to be making like maybe 6 figures or more just to live in some of those condos over there in high rises. But 2 men died in the home of Ed Buck, a small-time Democratic donor and political activist. Now, federal prosecutors say they have detailed a disturbing pattern in which he had exchanged drugs and money for sexual favors, citing at least 11 victims. This changes the story a bit. The paper's verified political account tweeted, okay, so here he is, 2 men died in the home of Ed Buck, a small-time Democratic donor. This was out of the New York Times Politics, and the political activist they say he was. So now federal prosecutors say they have detailed disturbing patterns in which he exchanged drugs and money for sexual favors, citing at least 11 victims. So it changes from 10 to 11 in this story. So political satirists and No Things Considered host Tim Young questioned why the paper would diminish Buck's contributions to the Democratic Party. So is the New York Times being sassy or sarcastic with the Twitter now, or are they pushing a blatantly false narrative? So he's a mega millionaire who lives in West Hollywood and donated hundreds of thousands of dollars to the Democrats in the last few years alone, Young told Fox News. There is nothing even remotely small about those numbers, Young added. So the Gray Lady also called Buck a small-time Democratic donor in the lead of a story about him facing federal charges. So the New York Times did not immediately respond to the request for comment. Buck is 65 years old. He was charged with distributing methamphetamine, resulting in Moore's death. He would face a minimum of 20 years in prison if he is convicted. So Buck was charged earlier this week with causing the overdose of another man who escaped the West Hollywood home this month. The man escaped the apartment and reportedly called for help at a nearby gas station. The third man, Timothy Dean, 55, he died of the overdose in Buck's home this past January. So prosecutors said Buck provided drugs and several men over the years after bringing them to his home, and they described the political donor as someone who preyed upon homeless and drug addicts. So the real threat of bias in the media is how pervasive it has become. Black men have died at the hands of this predator, and the priority of the New York Times is covering for their preferred political party, conservative strategist Chris Barron told Fox News. Disgusting. And so here it is right here. So this is the third time the Times has made news with a tweet in recent days under its New York Times Opinion Twitter banner, and the paper issued an apology late Saturday saying it had deleted an offensive message promoting the controversial and now revised article that made allegations against Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh. So we deleted the previous tweet regarding this article. Times Opinion said it was offensive and we apologize. And so the original Times tweet graphically described an obscene act that Kavanaugh is accused of having done during his college years, and the tweet then said that the act may seem like harmless fun. So the New York Times also caused an uproar last week, now deleted the tweet and now updated the story that the originally said airplanes, not terrorists, were responsible for the 9/11 attack on the World Trade Center. So 9/11 anniversary message was immediately met with harsh criticism and was swiftly deleted as well. And so this is how people feel about how this particular media has portrayed this particular guy. And so, like I said, that they feel that he's being downplayed. And this might be more in a political fashion of anger, but for those that are against Democrats. But what I'm saying is that just in general, if we go back to the original article and what this man has done to these now not 10 but 11 males, as they stated in the other article, this was really scary. But there is a video attached to it. It's probably the same exact video that was on the news. And so it's very scary what this man did. So he had a lot of money. And like I said, just to live over in the West Hollywood area, you cannot be some small-time person. You are extremely wealthy if you're able to live over there, and you know wealthy people are related to them. But with that being said, I'm going to let this video go. Like, comment, subscribe, and thank you for listening.
On Tuesday, my office filed a criminal complaint against Defendant Buck for an incident on September 11th in which he injected the victim with a large dose of methamphetamine. Fortunately, that victim lived. The latest incident is further evidence that shows a troubling and disturbing pattern, especially given that Defendant Buck was aware of the dangers of his behavior and that there was an ongoing investigation into the deaths of Mr. Moore and Mr. Dean. The surviving victims' statements gave us the break we needed. It gave legally sufficient evidence to establish the charged crimes and prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt in state court. Given this new evidence, my office worked diligently with law enforcement and my prosecutors and filed 3 felony charges on Tuesday against Defendant Buck. They were battery causing serious injury, administering methamphetamine, and maintaining a drug house.
As you reported earlier this week, Ed Buck, a man known in political circles for his support of various causes in Los Angeles, was arrested Tuesday on state charges alleging that he operated a drug den, among other charges. Today I am announcing a federal case against Mr. Buck, a case that charges him with distributing methamphetamine that directly resulted in the overdose death of Jamel Moore, a 26-year-old man who died in Mr. Buck's West Hollywood apartment on July 27, 2017. As a result of the case filed last night in United States District Court, District Attorney Jackie Lacey agreed that Mr. Buck should be transferred to federal custody to face charges that carry a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in federal prison and a maximum of life in prison without parole. The evidence collected by members of the federal task force, which also includes the FBI, indicates that Mr. Buck brought Mr. Moore to Los Angeles for the purpose of engaging in sexual activity, and then Mr. Buck agreed to pay the victim with money and narcotics. During the investigation, Mr. Moore's mother told investigators that her son reported, months before his death, that Mr. Buck had, quote, held Mr. Moore against his will and shot him up with drugs, unquote. Investigators with the Sheriff's Department several months ago located a homeless man in a West Hollywood park who said he had heard about Mr. Buck from other men who referred to Mr. Buck as Dr. Kevorkian because he was, quote, well known for compensating male prostitutes with drug and money, unquote.